Imagine you built one of the greatest empires the ancient world had ever seen. You conquered your enemies. You sat on the throne of the most powerful civilization on earth. You built more pyramids than any nation before you or after you. And then, the world forgot you existed. Not because your empire fell in disgrace. Not because your people vanished. But because someone, somewhere, decided that your story didn't fit the version of history they wanted to tell. This is the story of the Kingdom of Kush, the African empire that marched north, crushed Egypt's resistance, and placed black pharaohs on the most famous throne in human history. And what nobody tells you about the Kingdom of Kush is what they did to make sure you never found out. Before we go any further, if you are someone who believes that history is more than what is printed in textbooks, if you have ever felt that the stories of entire civilizations were buried beneath the weight of someone else's agenda, then you are in the right place. This channel exists to pull those stories out of the dark, to name the empires that were unnamed, to honor the rulers who were dishonored, and to ask the questions that too many people are afraid to ask out loud. If that sounds like the kind of history you want to know, hit subscribe right now, because we are just getting started, and what's coming next in this video will genuinely change how you see the ancient world. Now, let's go back, way back, to a time before Egypt was Egypt as we know it. Close your eyes for a moment. Picture the Nile Valley, thousands of years ago. Not the Egypt of Hollywood movies, not the Egypt of golden masks in glass cases. I'm talking about something older, something rawer, something that was alive long before the pharaohs of the north ever picked up a scepter. The region we now call Sudan, that stretch of land that runs south of Egypt along the Nile, was not empty. It was not barren. It was not waiting for civilization to arrive. It was already home to one of the most complex, sophisticated, deeply rooted cultures the ancient world had ever produced. The people here had their own gods, their own language, their own kingdoms, their own way of understanding the stars, the river, the soil, the sacred. They called their land Kush, and Egypt was their neighbor, not always a friendly one. For centuries, Egypt looked south and saw something it wanted: gold, ivory, ebony, cattle, and people enslaved and forced to labor under Egyptian rule. The Egyptians called the people of Kush Nazi, a word that roughly translates to the Southerners. They painted them on temple walls, depicted as prisoners, as tribute bearers, as lesser. And yet here is what those temple paintings quietly, reluctantly reveal: the Kushites kept coming back. Because you do and keep painting someone on your walls for centuries unless they are a presence you cannot ignore. Egypt colonized parts of Kush, built temples there, installed governors, extracted wealth. For hundreds of years, the balance of power seemed clear. Egypt was the lion, Kush was the prey, or so it appeared. But here is what happens when you spend centuries trying to suppress a people with their own deep identity, their own sense of divine purpose, their own history older than your empire. They adapt, they absorb, they learn from you. As Egypt's new kingdom began to crumble around 1070 BCE, as the pharaohs grew weak, the priests grew powerful, and the country fractured into competing power centers, something remarkable was happening to the south. Kush was consolidating. A new capital had risen at a place called Napata, nestled in the shadow of a mountain called Gebel Barkal. And to the Kushites, that mountain was not just a geological feature, it was the home of the god, Amun, the most powerful deity in the known world. The same god that Egypt had been worshipping for centuries. The Kushites had adopted Amun, but more than adopted, they believed they were his true chosen people, that Egypt had drifted away from its divine purpose, that the north had become corrupt, fractured, hollow, and one man, more than any other, decided to act on that belief. His name was Piye, and the world was about to learn exactly who the Kingdom of Kush really was. To understand Piye, you have to understand the world he inherited. Egypt in the mid-700s BC was not one country. It was a patchwork of city-states, each ruled by its own local prince or warlord. The Libyan dynasties had carved the north into pieces. Memphis, the ancient heart of Egypt, had changed hands so many times it barely remembered who it belonged to. And into this chaos, from the south, came a man of extraordinary conviction. Piye was not a conqueror in the conventional sense. He was not driven purely by greed or territorial ambition. What drove him was something far more dangerous. He believed he was right. He believed that Amun had chosen him, that the sacred order of Egypt, the Mot, the divine balance, had been shattered by the northern kings, and that it was his sacred duty to restore it. Think about what that means for a moment. This was not a man invading a foreign country. In his mind and in the minds of his people, he was going home. He was reclaiming something that belonged to the god they both served. Around 744 BCE, Piye received word that a Libyan king named Tefnakt was unifying the north, was gathering armies, was marching south along the Nile, absorbing city after city. Tefnakt wasn't just expanding his power, he was threatening to reunite Egypt under his rule, under Libyan rule. Piye could not allow that. What happened next is recorded on one of the most remarkable historical documents ever discovered, the Victory Stele of Piye, a massive stone inscription found at Gebel Barkal in the 19th century. And what it reveals is astonishing. Piye didn't just send an army north. He gave his generals strict religious orders before they even crossed the border. His soldiers were to purify themselves before battle, to pray to Amun, to approach the sacred cities of Egypt not as conquerors but as worshippers, to harm no temple, to desecrate nothing holy. This was a religious campaign as much as a military one, and it worked. City by city, the northern princes fell. Some fought, some surrendered, some opened their gates the moment they saw the Kushite banners on the horizon. Hermopolis resisted. Piye besieged it personally, furious that his generals had allowed the siege to drag on. When the city finally fell and he was brought before the captured horses that had been starved during the siege, he reportedly wept. He wept, not for the people, for the horses, because horses were sacred, because suffering was suffering, regardless of species, because this was a man whose moral framework was so deep, so specific, that it made him utterly unlike any conqueror his enemies had ever faced. And then he reached Memphis. Memphis was the crown jewel. The ancient capital, the city where the gods of Egypt had been honored since the very beginning. Tefnakt had retreated north, but his allies had fortified Memphis. They believed the city was impregnable, its walls reinforced, its harbor packed with ships, its population ready to resist. Piye looked at the harbor and saw an opportunity. He ordered his soldiers to seize the boats docked at the waterfront to use them as scaling ladders against the harbor walls. The Egyptians had never seen that tactic before. They had prepared for a land siege, not for an attack from the water. Memphis fell in a single assault. And what Piye did next is what separates him from almost every conqueror in recorded history. He walked into the temple of Ptah, the creator god of Memphis, and he made offerings. He prayed. He purified himself. He did not loot the city. He did not massacre the people. He did not tear down the temples of his enemies' gods. He worshipped. Because in his mind, these were not his enemies' gods. These were his gods. This was his city. This was his Egypt. And that was only the beginning of the story. One by one, the princes of Egypt came to Piye. They brought gold. They brought horses. They brought incense and linen and every luxury their cities could spare. And here is the twist that the history books barely whisper about. Some of them were refused entry into Piye's presence. Not because Piye was arrogant, not because he was making a political statement about domination, but because they hadn't purified themselves, because they ate forbidden foods, because they had not followed the religious customs that Piye considered sacred. These were Egyptian princes, in their own land, being judged by a Kushite king for not being Egyptian enough. Wrap your mind around that for a moment. The conqueror was more devoted to Egypt's traditions than the Egyptians themselves. The man from the south cared more about the sanctity of Amun than the men who had been worshipping Amun's temples for generations. History had been turned completely upside down. Piye returned to Kush. He had done what he came to do. He had restored order, punished the wicked, honored the gods. He left governors in place and sailed home. But the story was far from over. His successors Shabaka, Shebitku, Taharqa, Tantamani would rule Egypt for nearly a century. They became what historians call the 25th dynasty, and together they represent one of the most fascinating chapters in all of human history. These were black African kings sitting on the throne of Egypt, wearing the double crown, commissioning monuments, waging wars, negotiating with the great powers of the ancient Near East. And they were brilliant. Under their rule, Egypt experienced a renaissance. Ancient temples were restored, old traditions were revived, art and architecture flourished in ways that hadn't been seen in generations. The pharaoh Taharqa, arguably the greatest of the Kushite rulers, is mentioned in the Bible. He is referenced in the Book of Kings and the Book of Isaiah as a powerful king who stood against the might of Assyria. The Bible mentions Kush. Let that sink in. This was not a footnote civilization. This was a civilization that the ancient world's greatest writers and chroniclers acknowledged as a force to be reckoned with. But here is where the story takes a dark turn. In the 7th century BC, a new power was rising in the east. The Assyrian Empire, brutal, methodical, terrifyingly effective, had been consuming kingdoms across the Levant like a wildfire consumes dry grass, and they had set their sights on Egypt. Taharqa prepared. He fortified the delta cities. He built alliances. He fought back. Twice he was driven out of Memphis. Twice he returned and reclaimed it. The sheer tenacity of the man was extraordinary. But the Assyrians were relentless. Their iron weapons cut through everything. Their siege tactics were refined over centuries of conquest. In 667 BCE, under the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal, the final campaign was launched. Memphis fell. Thebes fell. The sacred city of Thebes, the spiritual heart of Egyptian civilization, was sacked, its temples looted, its people driven into exile. Even the ancient writers were horrified. The prophet Nahum referenced the fall of Thebes as a warning to Nineveh. Are you better than Thebes? The 25th dynasty was over. The Kushite pharaohs were gone. But what happened next, what the Assyrians and the new Egyptian dynasties did to the memory of Kush, is the real crime of this story. Here is what they did. The new rulers of Egypt, the Sate pharaohs of the 26th dynasty, backed by Assyrian power, did not simply move on. They rewrote. Inscriptions were altered. Monuments were rededicated. The names of Kushite pharaohs were chiseled off temple walls. Their statues were buried or destroyed. Their records were not preserved. And then, centuries later, when Greek writers came to Egypt and asked about its history, they were told the story that the Sate dynasty wanted told, a story in which the 25th dynasty barely existed, a story in which Egypt's greatest achievements were the achievements of dynasties that looked more like the Greeks themselves. History is written by the survivors, and the Kushites, driven back to their homeland in the south, were no longer in a position to write it themselves. For 2,000 years, the Kingdom of Kush was effectively invisible to European scholarship. The pyramids at Meroe, there are more of them than in Egypt, did you know that? Were dismissed as minor curiosities. The inscriptions in the Meroitic script were untranslatable and therefore unimportant. The civilization that had produced pharaohs, astronomers, iron smelters, traders who reached as far as India and Rome, that civilization was filed under primitive and forgotten. In 1821, an Italian explorer named Giuseppe Forlini arrived in Sudan. He was looking for treasure. He found something else. Pyramids, dozens of them, sharper and more slender than Egypt's, rising from the desert like stone needles pointing at the sky. Forlini dynamited the tops of several of them looking for gold. He found some jewelry which he later sold, some to museums in Berlin and Munich. But in his destructive rush for treasure, he damaged structures that had stood for 2,000 years. The irony is almost unbearable. The kingdom that survived Assyrian invasion, that outlasted Greek conquest, that endured the rise of Rome, was partially destroyed by a man with explosives looking for something shiny to sell. But the pyramids remained. The ruins of Meroe remained. The grave goods remained. And eventually, serious archaeologists arrived. The story began to be pieced back together. The victory stele of Piye, that extraordinary document written in perfect Egyptian hieroglyphics by a Kushite king, was excavated and translated. Scholars began to realize what they were looking at, not a footnote, a civilization. Let me tell you what we know about Kush at its height. Let me give you just a few moments to truly feel the scale of what was almost lost forever. At its peak, the Kingdom of Kush controlled the largest territory of any African state outside of Egypt. Its capital, Meroe, was one of the great industrial cities of the ancient world, a center of iron production that may have helped spread iron technology across sub-Saharan Africa. The Kushites traded with Rome, with Arabia, with India. Artifacts from the Mediterranean have been found in Kushite tombs. Artifacts from Kush have been found in Roman collections. They had their own script Meroitic, which we still have not fully deciphered, an entire language, an entire body of literature, philosophy, theology, poetry, possibly sitting locked behind an alphabet that modern scholars are still working to unlock. They built more than 200 pyramids. Egypt built around 130. Kush built more. They worshipped powerful queens. The title Kande, anglicized as Candace in the Bible, referred to the Queen Mother, a figure of extraordinary authority in Kushite society. These were not ceremonial rulers. These were women who commanded armies, made treaties, and governed empires. There is a story, possibly legendary, possibly true, of a one-eyed Kandake, named Amanirenas, who fought against the Roman Empire, who sent her soldiers to attack Roman-controlled Egypt after Augustus Caesar imposed heavy taxes on Kush, who reportedly had the head of a Roman emperor buried beneath the steps of a temple, so that every person who entered would forever walk over the face of Rome. Let me say that again. A queen of Kush may have buried the head of Caesar's statue beneath her temple steps, so that her people could walk over the face of the Roman Empire every single day, and you have never heard her name. The Kingdom of Kush did not end in a single catastrophic moment. Great civilizations rarely do. It faded, it contracted, the trade routes shifted, the climate changed, the Nile's behavior became less predictable. New powers, the Kingdom of Axum to the southeast, rose to challenge Kushite dominance. Around 350 CE, the Axumite king Izana invaded Meroe, the city fell, the great iron furnaces went cold, the pyramids were abandoned to the desert wind, and after more than 1,000 years of continuous civilization, longer than the entire span of the Roman Empire, Kush was gone. But was it really gone? Or did it simply transform? The descendants of the Kushites became the ancestors of modern Sudanese people. Their art, their religious practices, their architectural traditions, fragments of them survived in the cultures that came after. The Nubian people who live along the Nile today carry that inheritance in their language, their music, their memory. History does not die, it changes shape. There is a question I want you to sit with for a moment. Why does it matter that we know this story? I mean, Kush fell over 1600 years ago. The pyramids are still standing. The archaeology is ongoing. Why does it matter whether this kingdom is famous or forgotten? Here is why it matters. Because the erasure of Kush was not an accident of time or neglect. It was deliberate. It was a choice made by people with power, in order to tell a story about civilization that excluded certain people from it. When European scholars first seriously engaged with ancient Egyptian archaeology in the 18th and 19th centuries, they came with a set of assumptions already in place. Assumptions about race, about civilization, about which peoples were capable of which achievements. And when the evidence of Kush challenged those assumptions, when the evidence said that black African kings had sat on Egypt's throne, had built more pyramids than Egypt, had traded with Rome and India, some of those scholars found ways to minimize it, to explain it away, to file it under minor and move on. That is not history. That is politics wearing history's clothing. The story of Kush is not a story about black history versus white history, or African history versus European history. It is a story about human history in all its complexity, its glory, its tragedy, and its stubborn refusal to be fully suppressed. It is a story about what happens when a civilization decides that its God is worth dying for, when a king decides that righteousness matters more than mercy to his enemies, when a queen decides that no empire, not even Rome, has the right to walk over her people. It is, in other words, a deeply human story, and you deserve to know it. Here is a question I want to leave you with. Piye conquered Egypt. He did it with extraordinary restraint, no mass killing, no looting of temples, no destruction of culture. He considered himself a liberator, not a conqueror. Was he right? When he looked at the fractured, chaotic Egypt of his era and decided that he, a foreigner, by any conventional definition, had the duty to restore order to it, was that arrogance? Or was it conviction? Was it imperialism? Or was it something more complicated? And here is the harder question. If you had been a prince of northern Egypt, watching the Kushite army march toward your city, what would you have done? Would you have fought for your independence against a man who believed his God commanded him? Or would you have looked at the fractured world around you, at the corruption and the weakness and the hollow shells of temples no longer truly worshipped, and thought, maybe he has a point, these are not easy questions, they were not easy then, they are not easy now, and that is exactly why this story deserves to be told. We began this story with a simple, devastating truth. A civilization built one of the greatest empires the ancient world had ever seen. It conquered Egypt. It placed its kings on history's most famous throne. It built more pyramids than any nation before it. And then the world forgot it existed. But you haven't forgotten, not anymore. The names Piye, Taharqa, Amanirenas, they are yours now. The pyramids of Meroe, the victory steel, the iron furnaces, the double uraeus crown yours. History cannot be fully erased. It can be buried, it can be minimized, it can be locked behind an undeciphered script, but it cannot be destroyed. Not really, not as long as there are people willing to go looking for it. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of how much human greatness has been quietly filed away and forgotten, then this channel exists for you. We are building a community of people who believe that every civilization deserves to be seen, every story deserves to be told. Subscribe, share this video with someone who needs to hear it. And leave me a comment, tell me, what part of the Kingdom of Kush surprised you most? Because the next story we're going to tell, it involves an African queen who went toe-to-toe with Julius Caesar, manipulated the most powerful man in the Roman world, and nearly changed the entire course of Western history. The story of that confrontation is even more unbelievable than this one. Stay with us, I'll see you in the next one.